Good evening. I'm Jim Walters. I am working with the Ethics and Aging Project and want to welcome you to this, the second of our series of 5 lectures that are in our project. The next one will be held 3 weeks from tonight, and Dr. Daniel Callahan of the Hastings Center will be our featured speaker. But this evening it gives me pleasure to introduce to you our primary lecturer and our respondent. Our primary lecturer this evening is Dr. John Coleman Bennett. Dr. Bennett is the President Emeritus of Union Theological Seminary. For many years, the leading theological seminary in this country, if not the world. And maybe some would like to think that it continues to be the leading seminary, John, and perhaps it is. Dr. Bennett has been a noted churchman for many, many decades, starting back in the 1930s. He now is retired at Pilgrim Place, a retirement community for particularly those who have worked with the United Church of Christ. He is 88 years old. And in an interview that we had a couple of weeks ago, tells me that the last 8 years have been some of the most delightful years that he has had. He is going to be presenting a topic, Old Age and Euthanasia, a theological and personal perspective. Dr. Bennett brings to this topic a lot of experience. He has been a professor at Union Theological Seminary as well as president. He has written over 10 books in the area of social ethics in his career. He has served on various ecumenical councils, including societies such as the World Council of Churches, National Council of Churches. He also has several honorary degrees. These degrees have come from such institutions as Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Princeton, and the list goes on, including several notable Catholic institutions, over 20 degrees in all. We're very happy that Dr. Bennett, from his distinguished career, will be able to address these important topics tonight. Responding to him will be Anthony Battaglia. Tony and I and Dave Larson and some of our other colleagues have been friends for several years, particularly associating at least on an annual basis, Tony, at the Society of Christian Ethics meetings, where Tony has been very active for several years. He is a professor of religious studies at Cal State Long Beach. He particularly has studied in the area of natural law and has published a volume in regard to a revised concept of the traditional Catholic notion of natural law. He got his dissertation did his dissertation under Paul Ramsey at Princeton University. We're happy that these two gentlemen can be with us. Our format will be very simple. Dr. Bennett, Dr. Battaglia, and then I will direct some discussion that we will have following their presentations. Let's welcome Dr. Bennett this evening.
Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, I feel highly honored to be included in this very elaborate program that the School of Religion of the university has planned. I've discovered that the people here who work on ethics and religion are the kind of people who make things happen. And this particular program is very ambitious. They had this large conference here a few days ago, and then they have innumerable forums, and they have this series of lectures all together. I shall begin by speaking of old age, rather than of the controversial issues raised by euthanasia. Old age is not a time in which people are chiefly waiting for the most appropriate form of euthanasia. Old age is a time which for many can include a long period of rich, satisfying, and creative life. Recognizing that is the place to begin. Old age includes many years. As we think of it conventionally, it begins when we are 65 and ends when some of us are 100. It is often said that we are young old people when we are somewhere between 65 and 75. But from my experience as a member of a retirement community of about 325 persons, I've been there 15 years, I would put the beginning of an old period somewhat later, certainly not before 80. And I am impressed by the liveliness of many people far into their 80s if they keep their basic health and live in a favorable environment and community. In a society in which so many members are less privileged, either in regard to health or in regard to environment and community, I may be describing a minority. But if that is true, how far is age the cause of functional weakness? I do not claim to know. But the question must be raised, and many other factors are certainly involved. Economic opportunities, access at various stages to health care are among them. I should admit that I have a vested interest in a more than usually favorable view of the possibilities for people who are 88 or thereabouts. Of course, there are limits of strength and of fresh initiatives, of planning for the future for those of us who are in their 80s. One of the saddest of our experiences is to know many neighbors who are struck down by long continued debilitating illnesses or by sudden strokes and heart attacks with permanent effects. But when we're generalizing about human possibilities and hopes, we should avoid dogmatism about limits earlier than I'm suggesting. Today there's much talk about a natural lifespan. Daniel Callahan, who speaks here at the next lecture, who brings very important pioneering guidance for our thinking about old age. In his books, the two titles are Setting Limits and What Kind of Life, makes much use of that phrase. In doing so, he courageously faces many realities. One of his major interests is the enormous and growing cost of medical care for society. And I think for people in our position here, frequently that is somewhat disguised if we are ourselves rather well insured. And he seeks to limit the care intended chiefly to lengthen life after one has lived through the natural lifespan. Now, I'm 6 or 8 years beyond that, you see. That's the problem. His second book strongly suggests that most people can achieve what has most value for them during that period, and that for them the meaning of their lives does not depend upon their living a little more and then a little more, even though they may very much desire to do so. He finds the end of the natural lifespan in the late 70s or early 80s. We might take 82 as optimistically the end to mention. After that, Callahan emphasizes medical care should be intended not to lengthen life, but to prevent or reduce suffering and to preserve a desirable quality of life. He does allow for exceptions, and in his book, Setting Limits, he doesn't mention them until page 184. It seems that he does not want to blunt his main argument until he has presented it fully. In that later passage, he speaks of physically vigorous elderly persons, and for them, he says, that all levels of care are appropriate, at least through the first round of illness and disease, and even for those who have lived a natural lifespan, if there's a solid prospect of a few, say 4 or 5 more years of a good life. I do not see that he integrates this exceptional status for such fortunate people which would surely be claimed by very many. He has not integrated this into his system. His main purpose is to lessen the excessive amount of medical care which now goes to those who, because of age, cannot expect improvement of life. One of the most important sentences in setting limits is this: a disproportionately large proportion of health care goes to the elderly dying. After admitting that at some stage age should be a basis for limiting the use of medical care, involving, for one thing, the length of time a person can be expected to benefit from even successful, expensive therapy, I want to raise a question which is not being raised by those who emphasize the concept of a natural span of life. Why should we assume that the length of this span is static, for the majority even? Should we not consider the possibility of lengthening the expected lifespan by improving the health care received by all people before they are 65, beginning with prenatal care? Not only medical care is essential, Professor James Childress, in an article entitled Priorities in the Allocation of Healthcare Resources, anticipated in 1968, much is being said now. He shows that medical care is less than many other factors in people's long-term health. Many factors in the environment and community in which people live, and especially in their style of life. He referred to such habits as taking exercise, good sleeping habits, the avoiding of dependence on tobacco or alcohol, etc. Medical care is crucial, of course, in the immunization of children and providing cures in various crises, but these other conditions of life are even more important in the lives of people before 65 if their history is likely to provide evidence for a natural span of life that is a few years longer than in Daniel Callahan's suggestions. However, I do not want to detract attention from the shameful fact that more than 35 million people in our country have no health insurance, and many more have no insurance against catastrophic illness. They inevitably postpone too long their visits to doctors because of expense. A fifth of children are among those who have no reliable access to medical care. Our society treats its elderly citizens better than its children. They have political clout, whereas neither poor children nor their parents have that clout. A large part of our population, when they begin at 65, the last stage of what is often called a natural lifespan, are already victims of our unjust medical system or lack of system. Now I'm going to speak about changing theological attitudes toward suicide. We cannot discuss the legitimacy of some forms of euthanasia without re-examining the traditional rejection of all suicide because of theological principles. There's often an element of suicide in both passive and active euthanasia. For example, when one of us leaves a directive to an agent asking that under some conditions one does not want to be kept alive, as many of us have done in signing the document that is legal in California called the Durable Power of Attorney for Health Care, the directive that calls for the hastening of death involves conditional assisted suicide. Many cases of active euthanasia, though they may not have legal support, implement the will to commit suicide. Shakespeare expressed the traditional view of suicide when he had Hamlet say, "Oh, that the everlasting had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. It would not be fair to Shakespeare to omit the fact that he knew of a different attitude towards suspected suicide, because, as it is said, Ophelia's death was doubtful. This comes from the grave scene in the 5th act of Hamlet. The priest refused to give her the full Christian funeral rites. Her brother Laertes says to the priest, "Lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violets spring. I tell thee, churlish priest, a ministering angel shall my sister be when thou liest howling." I think we tend to cheer Laertes, at least I do. Thomas Aquinas said that suicide is the most fatal of sins because it cannot be repented of. One can hardly exceed that statement in its absoluteness. One of the greatest Protestant theologians of this century, Karl Barth, is hardly less extreme. He wrote the following about suicide. Suicide, even according to nature, is a horrible aberration. From the standpoint of religion, suicide is a manifestation of the most extreme and arbitrary self-assertion. The suicide wants to be lord over life and death. Therefore, this sin directly violates the very majesty of God governing our life. I believe that this absolutistic denial of all suicide, which has in the past caused the churches to deal cruelly with the memories of suicides and with their families, no longer has the intuitive support of most people who read such words of condemnation. It may help us for me to report on 3 theologians who, when they speak in general terms, repeat the traditional condemnation of suicide, but when they deal with particular cases, they abandon it. I shall report on Karl Barth himself, on Father Bernard Herring, who has for 2 generations been one of the most influential Catholic moral theologians, and on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who is known to us as one of the Christian martyrs of our time, who also produced great writings in theological ethics. One more thing about Herring, it might be interesting to you. Not only has been a prestigious moral theologian, but since the very beginning, when Paul VI supported the current doctrine concerning birth control, Herring has been fighting it all along. Barth, only a few pages after he gives a traditional view of suicide, says the following: "Who can say that it is absolutely impossible for the gracious God himself to help a man in affliction to take this way out? In some cases, perhaps a man can and must choose and do this in the freedom given him by God, and not therefore in false sovereignty, in full self-assertion, but in true obedience." Now, Barth doesn't really give you any hint as to how you tell whether that's right view or not. He may have some very particular thing in mind. He knew lots of people who had this kind of problem in his time in Europe. A person who would take poison rather than under torture betray his cause. That would be an example of suicide of a very specific sort. But there may be probably many, many others that he would recognize. Bernard Herring makes a concession in this way: regardless of the sin of suicide taken objectively, we cannot and may not judge the subjective guilt of anyone who takes his own life. In many cases, an acute mental disturbance is present. In fact, we may assume this to be the case in those instances in which persons known to lead a virtuous life take their own lives in a fit of melancholy or under some degree of compulsion. Bonhoeffer allows for the possibility that a person may quite rationally take his own life for the sake of others, He says the following: if a sufferer from an incurable disease cannot fail to see that his care must bring about the material and psychological ruin of his family, and if he therefore by his own decision frees them from this burden by this unauthorized action. It's interesting that the thing that's wrong about suicide comes in there, this unauthorized action. And yet here too, a condemnation will be impossible. Do we not here see signs of theology being changed? Professor James Gustafson, one of the major living ethical theologians in this country, summarizes the results of this change in the following way: yet there are probably few persons in our society who are prepared to make a strong condemnation of a person who takes his or her life. He gives his own view by saying, this is a quote, "Suicide is always a tragic moral choice. It is sometimes a misguided choice, but it can be a conscientious choice." And he adds, "We must consent to its being done justifiably, tragically, mournfully." In 1981, I wrote in a symposium on ministry with the aging the following sentence: it seems to me that suicide committed by the dying may at times be the most defensible form of active, I called it that time positive, but I call it in this paper active euthanasia. It is based on the consent of the person involved, and often the motive is concern for others. The book had considerable use, but I have never heard a negative word about that sentence. Before leaving the subject of suicide, I want to warn against the misuse of what I have said. It will be very easy to remember that I have criticized the absolute rejection of suicide and forget what I shall now say. I should emphasize the enormous difference between suicide during a period of terminal illness and suicide that comes from youthful despair. There is sometimes an epidemic of such youthful suicides. We've lived during such epidemics ourselves. I've heard Arturo Rubinstein, the great pianist, say on TV that he tried to commit suicide when he was 22. But when he was 90, he thought he was the happiest man in the world. A good warning. Also, suicide may be a temptation that should be resisted as a matter of character, when it may appear to be a quick solution of or escape from a difficult decision or tormenting problem. When living in mature life with such a decision or problem creates or strengthens the virtues of loyalty to responsibilities, courage, and endurance. Even in the case of a long illness, often painful and always frustrating, suicide would often prevent experiences of spiritual growth. I learned this from an experience in my own family. One of its members, very close to me, suffered for 2 years from a struggle against cancer. She transcended that experience in a wonderful way until the last weeks and remained herself in her relations with others. She was an inspiration to others. I often thought that she combined what I call pain and frustration with an unusual form of blessedness. Such experiences probe life's depths. By contrast, illness is very different when in its loss and suffering we see the body surviving the self. Now I'll speak about passive euthanasia. I shall deal first with passive euthanasia, which in contrast to active euthanasia, or direct killing of the patient, mercy killing, involves a decision not to initiate therapy that would prolong life, or the removal of life supports in order to allow the disease to take its course and hasten death. There are many forms of passive euthanasia decisions, such as the removal of a respirator, allowing the patient to die of another disease such as pneumonia, stopping artificial feeding, which raises special problems that I shall discuss. Sometimes a directive is left, do not resuscitate in the case of heart failure. It will be authorized by a doctor with the consent of patient or agent or family. The conditions for such decisions would be a terminal illness that is irreversible with the prospect of early death, whatever is done, uncontrolled suffering, an irreversible comatose or vegetative condition which has already been long continued. There is a persistent debate as to whether there's any moral difference between passive and active euthanasia, since both have the same purpose, the hastening of death. When one has gone through the process of deciding that either passive or active euthanasia is justified, I doubt if there is any moral difference between the two kinds of acts themselves. I suggest that there are two differences related to them that may affect one's choice. One is a psychological difference that may have moral overtones in our minds. There are fewer inhibitions against allowing a disease to run its course toward death when obstacles have been removed than against direct killing. It is possible that a society that allows active euthanasia to become almost a routine matter in relation to some kinds of disease would reduce a highly desirable inhibition against killing. David Larson, in a speech that he made here in the big conference that we had, said that the results of a more permissive law and permissive policy in the Netherlands needs to be studied in regard to this. Also, I suggest that passive euthanasia depends for its methods on the particular conditions of the person affected and is less likely to be abused by being applied by a state or any other agency to a group of people. We have seen a case of discrimination against the poor when Oregon passed a law denying organ transplants to anyone on Medicaid. This meant that rationing was based on the capacity to pay. This is to be contrasted with rationing of some forms of expensive therapy on the basis of the prospects for success or of age with reference to the length of time a person might benefit from them. But of course, in the United States, we have a vast system of rationing on the basis of capacity to pay, on the basis of health insurance. States differ in the extent to which their laws permit passive euthanasia. I think New Jersey and Massachusetts have led the way. Some states allow it, but insist that persons involved must have left a directive for it, as was the case in Missouri when the Kruzan case came to its Supreme Court. Some states forbid the abandonment of artificial feeding, and this is often supported on moral and religious grounds because feeding is an essential part of everyday caring. California in 1985 passed a law which made available a legal document called Durable Power of Attorney for Health Care. I hope that most of us have signed it. This encourages early preparation for life and death decisions. It emphasizes the need for a person, when competent, to appoint agents who will supervise the implementation of that person's expressed desire. I quote one of three statements in this document, which the person who signs the document may initial, and which clearly prepares the way for passive euthanasia. Now, this document, I signed it in 1985, and it didn't have this very specific statement, but I found it in a more recent edition of it in 1989. Some of you may know more accurately when this particular statement came in. This is the quotation from it. "I do not want my life to be prolonged, and I do not want life-sustaining treatment to be provided or continued. if I am in an irreversible coma or persistent vegetative state, or if I am terminally ill and the application of life-sustaining procedures would serve only to artificially delay the moment of my death, or under any other circumstances where the burdens of the treatment outweigh the expected benefits. I want my agent to consider the relief of suffering and the quality as well as the extent of the possible extension of my life in making decisions concerning life-sustaining treatment. Seems to me that's an ideal thing to sign. I hope many of you will agree with that. This document may be legally enforced, and it is very widely distributed, and persons of all ages are encouraged to face its proposals. It's a good example of what should be done in all states to firm up and provide clarity to the legal basis for passive euthanasia. On June 25th, 1989, the U.S. Supreme Court for the first time faced the issues involved in passive euthanasia. Its decision in the case of Nancy Cruzan was tragic as far as she was concerned, but the majority and minority opinions throw light on what the court may permit in the future. Nancy Cruzan was in her 20s, but the issues discussed are important for all persons, old or young. Most of us know many of the facts in the case, but I shall remind you of just a few of them. After an automobile accident in her early 20s, Nancy Cruzan has been in an irreversible vegetative condition for 6 years. I think now it may be 7 years. She's been kept alive by a tube for artificial feeding in her stomach. Her parents asked the court to allow the tube to be removed. A lower court agreed to this, but the Supreme Court of Missouri, by a 4-3 decision, refused permission for the tube to be removed. She had not left in writing what she wanted to have done in such an unexpected situation. What young person would do so? Close friends did report that she had said that she would never want to live under the kind of conditions to which she is now condemned, and her parents were sure that this was the case. The U.S. Supreme Court went out of its way to praise the parents, and there was no question about their integrity and about their acting out of love. The Missouri Supreme Court acted on the basis of an assumption that needs to be challenged. They assumed that the state's interest was in the preservation of all human life as such, and did not want to be guided by concern about any quality of life. It is true that we would not want the state to make many authoritative judgments about qualities of life. But is there not one quality of life on which all other desirable qualities of life depend? The capacity for consciousness, the capacity for conscious human relations. The U.S. Supreme Court denied permission to remove the tube, and the main reason was that the Missouri court had the right to take its action because the incompetent's wishes, that is, the young woman's wishes as to withdrawal of the treatment, was not proved, and this is the technical phrase, by clear and convincing evidence. The four in the minority did not have any more knowledge of the wishes of Nancy Cruzan than the majority. But did they have the right to be guided in part by their realization that they would not want to live, and they would want their own loved ones to live as Nancy was forced by the court to live? Surely this was involved when Justice Stevens said, I quote, "The Constitution requires the state to care for Nancy Cruzan's life in a way that gives appropriate respect to her own best interests." I've given this attention to the Kruzan case not only because of the court's decisions about the fate of Nancy Cruzan, which was most unfortunate, but also because the opinions of the justices give clear support to passive euthanasia under other conditions. The majority in this case said that the Missouri Supreme Court had the right to insist on there being clear and convincing evidence concerning Nancy's real wishes. They were simply saying that the Missouri court was not unconstitutional. Chief Justice Rehnquist, in the majority's opinion, said that few cases of this sort had come before the courts before the Quinlan case 15 years ago, maybe no longer now, and that since then cases involving the right to self-sustaining treatment have burgeoned. He says the following about the present situation. The principle, this is a quote, the principle that a competent person has a constitutionally protected liberty interest in refusing unwanted medical treatment may be inferred from our previous decisions. And later he says, but for purposes of this case, we assume that the United States Constitution would grant a competent person a constitutionally protected right to refuse life-saving hydration and nutrition. This seems to me to be a radical statement, as some states have not permitted this very thing. Nancy Cruzan was not competent at the time and had not given directions about this when she was competent. Justice O'Connor, in her opinion, seems to me to express an implied regret concerning the fate of Nancy Cruzan. She says the following: few individuals, this is a quotation from Justice O'Connor, few individuals provide explicit oral or written instructions regarding their intent to refuse medical treatment should they become incompetent. And notice this sentence: states which decline to consider any evidence other than such instructions may frequently fail to honor a patient's intent. Such failures might be avoided if the state considered an equally probative source of evidence: the patient's appointment of a proxy to the court's survey of state, no, I got it wrong there. The patient's appointment of a proxy to make health care decisions on her behalf. As is evident from the court's survey of state court decisions, no national consensus has emerged for this difficult and sensitive problem. Today, we decide only that one state's practice does not violate the Constitution. The more challenging task of crafting appropriate procedures for safeguarding incompetence liberty is entrusted to the laboratory of the states in the first instance. Now, already California has provided a good report from that laboratory. And I would add one point: always it will be difficult for young people to see the need to appoint proxies or surrogates, but it should be less difficult to expect persons to do this as they approach old age. And then my last section is on active euthanasia. What should we think of active euthanasia? The direct killing of a person whose death would be a relief from a long period of intense suffering, or from a degenerative disease that prevents a person from having a future with hope for any positive qualities of life or any positive relations with others. His or her situation may not make passive euthanasia possible. He or she may have the feeling expressed in my quotation from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that is, if a sufferer from an incurable disease cannot fail to see that his care must bring about the material and psychological ruin of his family. I confess that I discuss active euthanasia with less confidence than I discussed passive euthanasia. Passive euthanasia now has a public history. It's now out in the open. Cases of active euthanasia are known to us, but often they're known only confidentially. The law only condemns it. Its practice may lead to indictment for murder, from which the only relief comes from the refusal of a jury to convict, or from a judge's reducing the penalty in light of the real human situation. If what I have said about suicide has any validity, it is difficult not to believe that an arrangement for active euthanasia may be defensible. I've already said that the act or event of passive euthanasia and the act or event of active euthanasia are not in themselves morally different. They have the same intention, the hastening of a person's death. The difference between them are that some of the byproducts of active euthanasia may be more problematic. As I've already hinted at this before, but institutionalized, if active euthanasia is institutionalized and becomes a very frequent occurrence, it may weaken the general human inhibition against killing. I am not so much concerned about its being on what we talked about at our conference the other day, as the slippery slope in medical care. I'm more worried about the inhibition against killing that now seems to be eroding widely in our society. Worry about that is stimulated by viewing the local Los Angeles Evening News. I do not say that this consideration should cause us to oppose active euthanasia on principle. It expresses only a concern. When active euthanasia is the only relief from degrees of suffering or from hopelessly dark and darker futures, I hope that active euthanasia may become legally possible with protection against its abuse. Those who support it emphasize the fact that it can more quickly end the suffering that justifies it than can passive euthanasia. I'm still impressed by a petition to the legislature of New York. It was signed by 120 of the Protestant ministers of New York City in 1947. The petition asked the legislature for a legal amendment that would permit voluntary euthanasia for incurable sufferers when authorized by a court of record upon receipt of a signed and attested petition from the sufferer and after investigation by a medical committee designated by the court. The reason that I have been impressed by that petition is not only the number of signers. 51 were Episcopal clergy, no fringe group, but by the fact that the letter that went out to enlist signatures was signed by Harry Emerson Fosdick, Henry Sloane Coffin, W. Russell Bowie, and John Howard Lathrop. Those names are better remembered by me than by the younger among you, but they represent the finest leadership in American Protestantism. I'm not familiar with the full history of what happened in regard to active euthanasia between 1947 and the effort to put what was called a humane and dignified death initiative on the ballot in California in 1989, which had only 120,000 signatures, though the main idea received a very large majority in many, many polls. I do not know that there was a continuous large-scale effort after 1947, but the miracles of medicine in greatly extending the length of life has in recent years greatly increased a new openness toward or support for both passive and active euthanasia. And in that connection, I do want to say one thing about our taking the place of God here, because in this extension of the length of life, we've already done that. And to find ways to counteract some of the effects of the extension of the length of life, this may be an effort of love that is not against the will of God. For 2 generations, one of the greatest American teachers of Christian ethics was Paul Ramsey of Princeton University, who died recently. He has always been quite conservative about life and death issues. But in his powerful book, The Patient as Person, published in 1970, he speaks of 2 situations that may call for either passive or active euthanasia. Cases of patients in deep and irreversible coma, and a kind of prolonged dying in which it is medically impossible to keep severe pain at bay. In what follows, and in a note, he indicates he was still making up his mind as to whether it is possible always to keep pain at bay. It is often assumed that the means of doing this may weaken the patient and thus hasten death. Such means, since they are not intended to kill, should not come under the heading of euthanasia. Ramsey has no doubt about what should be done in the comatose situation. He makes the judgment that in these extreme situations, we have correctly located the point at which the crucial moral difference between omission and commission as a guide to faithful actions has utterly vanished. And it's very important to note that, because it indicates that he has in mind here both omission, which would be active, passive euthanasia, and commission, which would be active euthanasia. He has them both in mind as he thinks about this problem. To me personally, it is very important that Ramsey, in view of his dominant assumptions, did come to sanction even active euthanasia in some situations. I believe that active euthanasia can at times be supported religiously and morally as a matter of conscience. Great difficulties will remain for institutions to sanction it. People so generally die in hospitals and nursing homes, and the reputation of an institution will suffer when the number of deaths in it increase. And of course also there's great need to change the whole legal situation. Now I come to my last page here. The first lecture in this series by former Governor Lamb of Colorado dealt with the larger public issues raised by the explosions of medical technology and the tremendous momentum of increasing costs of medical care for society, costs that are related to the fact that most of us live so much longer than earlier generations. Governor Lamb told us how badly he had been misquoted when he first raised this issue. He'd said something like this: "It's a duty of old people to die." And that got in the headlines. And everything he said to deny that he'd ever said it didn't get very much, even on the first page. That was his unfortunate experience. The next lecture will be given by Daniel Callahan, whose analysis of this public situation has raised the questions which the whole world of ethics and medical care has been discussing for years. There's been debate about some of his answers, but no doubt about the importance of his questions. What I have discussed this evening has important implications for Callahan's questions and answers. His proposal that after a certain age, which he identifies as the late 70s or early 80s, medical care that is intended chiefly to extend the length of life should not be given to people, only medical care to prevent or reduce suffering. Essential to his system is the shortening of life. This is not quite the same as passive euthanasia, which involves not the shortening of life, but the hastening of death. But Callahan has room for that also, and even supports the withholding of food. But he's strongly opposed to suicide, to assisted suicide, and to active euthanasia. I have not emphasized the support for either form of euthanasia that comes from their relevance to this very important problem of the costs of medical care. I have left that to others. My concern here is for the dignity and quality of life of individual patients, their freedom from the fate of a living death imposed upon them by doubtful dogmas or the law. I am concerned about them and about the anxieties, the hard decisions, and the suffering of their families.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is really a singular honor to be here this evening, not only to be on the program of this distinguished series, but especially to be sharing a podium with John Bennett. Our topic is one on which he is unusually well qualified to speak. As you can sort of guess, looking in my direction, I'm not sure exactly when he became president of Union Theological Seminary, but I believe it was around the time that I was being born. in 1939. I don't know where you were in 1939, John, but I suspect you were already president of Union at that point.
Berkeley then.
You were in Berkeley then, okay. His distinguished career lends a special credibility to a discussion of old age and euthanasia. His age and consequent experience give him an authority on this topic that I cannot approach. Fortunately for me, I find myself in general agreement with the positions that he has taken. And the remarks that I will make at this point are approaching the same topics from perhaps a slightly different direction. I am especially interested in the fact that the idea of suicide can be a moral thing is a relatively new idea. I am interested in the change in morality that such a notion brings with it. And my interest in John's paper basically approaches the question from that point of view. As an example of the lessons of experience, I cannot but admire the delicacy with which he has stated the most central of his positions here. At a critical moment in his discussion of recent Christian theology, he pulls back from drawing a conclusion about willing our own death. He recounts a growing number of cases where notable Christian theologians voice their willingness to make exceptions to the absolute prohibition of suicide. His conclusion seems to leap out at us that there are cases, perhaps especially ones called into existence by the category of incurable suffering, which lead us to a different evaluation of this action, long thought of as morally bad. Bennet stops short of that conclusion, or at least he does in its fullest form, and instead we get a question. Do we not, he asks, see signs here of theology being changed? Well, yes, we certainly do. Barth, Bonhoeffer, Herring, Gustafson, and Ramsey, to someone who studies the high tradition of Christian theology in the 20th century, these are formidable names, and one recognizes here a growing consensus from a different point of view. Nevertheless, using such delicacy to approach the topic of change in morality is fitting. Moral reasoning is essentially conservative, I think. It seems to be very much a process of learning from the past. I am inclined to think that such learning, along with the uncommon process we call common sense and the pragmatic test of time, are far more important in moral matters than the more intellectual processes of following rules or calculating utility that recent moral philosophy commends to us, or some of it does. Without the lessons of the past, we are teetering on the brink of barbarism. The voracious chaos we try to fend off as best we can, but which we all carry around within us in more or less tamed form. It is for some reasons like this, a recognition of our reliance upon the past, that we treasure continuity in morality much more than innovation. We look to the scriptures, to the leaders of our communities, to the sages of the past for guidance. In dealing with moral change, we are dealing with something that is doubly new. The idea of change is new. The changes usher in are also new. When we turn from the idea of change to the details of what we are changing, we can see here too a reason to be cautious. Like Mr. Bennett, I think that we are gradually moving toward an acceptance of both suicide and euthanasia. I agree that the distinction between active and passive euthanasia is not a strong one, and that the moral distinction is the one between having a permissive attitude toward the possibility of suicide in extremis and the absolute prohibition of which Hamlet spoke, the one against self-slaughter. But I hear in John Bennett's approach to the topic a real disquiet that I think is justified. I want to reinforce two of the cautions he has already stated. I think, in fact, there is little worry that the elderly will flock to suicide like lemmings. The lesson that life is precious emerges pretty naturally from living, I think. But there is danger that if we lessen our insistence on the wonder of life and the responsibility to accept it as God's gift, that the weaker ones among us, and especially the vulnerable young, will respond to this acceptance more than we could ever wish. But this having been said, our attitude toward our own death is such that we are likely to be very cautious in moving toward the acceptance of suicide. I mean that of mature adults or people growing older. But euthanasia is another matter. I hear in John's text a real worry about the effect on our society of opening the possibility of any euthanasia. Other people's lives are always going to be easier for us to underestimate, undervalue, than our own will be. And there is already present in too many members of our society a malignant lack of concern for the victims of AIDS, for those who bear the consequences of our atrocious infant mortality rate, for the many for whom there is next to no healthcare system at all. Any slow, hesitant steps in the direction of allowing either passive or active euthanasia, and especially the latter, must as a consequence be fenced in with provisos and whereases, with rules and prohibitions and cautions. As John says rightly, there is already a body of case law slowly growing on these topics, beginning with relatively easy examples, and we are all in the process of learning about durable powers of attorney and similar matters. Concern about euthanasia becomes much greater as we proceed towards active euthanasia. Once we grow accustomed to loosening the bond against passive euthanasia, once durable powers of attorney are commonplace and the legal remedies to Nancy Cruzan type situations are a part of ordinary life, then the difference between withholding life-giving care and promoting death are likely to seem too similar in intention and too alike in technological methods to be easily divided. On the other hand, they are still important, and we ought not to undermine them too rapidly. I am not persuaded by camel's nose or slippery slope arguments, the kind which remind us that euthanasia was the first step the Nazis took down the road that led to Auschwitz, and draw the conclusion that any step in the direction of euthanasia is a step toward moral abomination. Rather, it seems to me that we are always poised on slippery slopes, that there are always justified exceptions to absolute rules. These are always in danger of leading to greater and greater exceptions or to a disrespect for all rules, that any exceptions might lead to greater and greater excess, but they do not, and they do not in a way that is useful to think about for just a moment. What keeps in place the distinction between justified and unjustified violence, between sex and sexism, between necessary discipline and child abuse, between active and passive euthanasia? These examples are all located on such slippery slopes that we wonder that all of them do not always lead to excess. They are kept apart, I think, by acts of will, by meaningful distinctions made and accepted and reinforced by communities over and over, and passed on to others through moral discussion, imagery, ritual, and example. We internalize them as obvious and natural distinctions because we are strongly urged to do so. We are told to do so, and the distinctions are reenacted for us in sermons or on TV or in stories that we tell one another as morally relevant examples of the way people behave. It is hard to predict where such lines are going to be drawn, but it is one of the jobs of people such as John Bennett to make suggestions as to suitable distinctions. It is one of the functions of forums like this to offer them to communities such as you, so that they can be mulled over, chewed, and tasted. Thus, such notions gather strength from our collective will and our collective intelligence, and can provide us with a firm footing on which to base our moral judgments. There is still a lot of specific, detailed work that needs doing here, but the big picture also needs attention. The moral evaluation of newer kinds of life-lengthening technology and the testing of our moral intuitions about when life is no longer present or no longer present enough so that we need to continue or expand their use needs a great deal of mulling over. In addressing these issues, we need also the collective will to face these questions boldly, and we need the help of experienced, wise, even old people like John Bennett in helping us think our way through the thicket that surrounds our ordinary human path. Thank you.
Does someone have a question to begin with, or a comment? Yes, ma'am.
I'm very interested in some more data on the people who live in your housing arrangement in Claremont, others who are your age, others who've passed the natural lifespan, how they feel about their satisfactions in life, and you personally, how you feel about yours past the lifespan. If I were in your position, I think today, I would want to continue living, and I wouldn't be thinking about euthanasia at all. How do you feel, and how about your friends that live similarly?
Could you hear the question?
Oh, sure. Well, you were asking about Pilgrim Place, and I've always said about it that unlike, I think, a good many retirement communities, it's as stimulating as it is supportive. And one reason for that is a kind of unfortunate elitism. We don't take anybody over 65. So we have a continuous stream of people who are in their 60s, late 60s. I said 70, we take nobody over 75. We have a stream of younger people who keep people like myself younger, and I know that's true. Now, as for one's own feeling about, this is also a problem that Tony raised, what one feels about one's own span of life and therefore one's own death. To me, there's only one thing that I'm afraid of, and that is that my body may survive myself. I mean, that's the one thing I'm afraid of. And apart from that, that I think does point toward finding some form of euthanasia, if that seems to be the best way of preventing such an event from taking place.
Thank you, John. Anybody over here on the left side? Okay, Richard? Yes.
I'm wondering if either one of the two gentlemen who spoke to us has any experience about how people feel after they've made a durable power of attorney for health with good intentions of following it through, whether or not those intentions stay the same when it really comes to time. Do you find some reversals there? Is it always a sure thing that when people sign a durable power of attorney with the stipulations that you had in it, are really going to want that when the time comes?
John, what about that at Pilgrim Place? Have you seen people changing their minds?
I don't know of individuals who change their mind. I think I'm not sure that I've talked with people who would reveal such a change of mind. We're all encouraged to sign it by the authorities because that's a good thing for the institution, I guess, as well as for the people. But we just sort of take it all for granted. Now, individuals could. There must be points at which you say, well, this isn't quite time yet. I still can do things that I want to do. And that would certainly be true of any of us, I think, at some stage. To draw the line absolutely is very difficult to do in advance.
Your question reminds me of attending a conference in Santa Monica that was run by the Hemlock Society, which is an active euthanasia society. And there was a woman lecturing who had been quite positive about her willingness to accept death until she got stage 4 cancer, which she had at the time she gave the lecture. And she did admit that when she was looking death down the barrel, as it were, that she was having some second thoughts about that. Anything to say on this, Tony?
The conference that was held here a couple of weeks ago, someone did in fact report on a longitudinal study along these lines. And a certain group of people, all of whom were seriously ill and were seeing doctors regularly, were offered the opportunity of signing a durable power of attorney and so forth. And a certain percentage did, and a certain percentage did not. And my remembrance of the data is that in the course of a year, several of the people who did not decided to do so, but nobody of the people who had backed out of it. So that it seemed to be that once you got used to the idea and it began to seem more like the sort of thing that other people were doing, an appropriate thing to do, I think people became more comfortable with it.
I think it's important to point out the 3 points in that statement. The first point is be factual, and nothing much you could do about it. If I am in an irreversible coma or persistent vegetative state, if you are in that state, you haven't much a chance to do much about it. But in advance, you knew that that would be a protection against your being forced to be kept alive in that state, would certainly be helpful, at least to me, to have that protection. And then the second one was, if I am terminally ill and the application of life-sustaining procedures would serve only to artificially delay the moment of my death. There might be momentary differences, but certainly that's true. The other one, the third, is broader. Under any other circumstances where the burdens of the treatment outweigh the expected benefits. I think that was the sort of thing that was in the 1985 statement. And I don't know just how it happened to get changed, and this became more specific.
Yes, David. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I am a registered nurse, and in some of my past experience with the seniors in a hospital setting, I think that what we found is that the patient themselves is comfortable with this decision, but often the significant other family member isn't. They seem to find it awfully difficult to comply with the decisions that maybe the individual has made, and sometimes chose to challenge that. There are times we have found with physicians, for moral reasons, don't agree with these or don't feel that it's appropriate to follow through with these wishes. It definitely needs to be done and is essential, but is not without its challenges along the way.
It's my understanding that if a physician finds him or herself unable to follow the dictates of the durable power, that he or she is obligated to pass the case to someone who can. Is that correct?
You hope that's what will happen.
That's the theory, right?
Yes, in theory, that's what needs to happen, but unfortunately does not always. Or in an emergency room type of situation, in an urgent situation when they're not aware something like this does exist, you need to get it ASAP so that they can follow through with your wishes.
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I was the mother of a hemophiliac that contracted AIDS and passed away in January of '89, the same night and the same hour that they showed the Ryan White story on national television for the first time. I want to know about euthanasia. The last few weeks of his life was very low quality, to the point that it was reduced to lower than an animal. And I want to know about active euthanasia. Let's say legally it was a legal entity. And how would would it be decided that this take place?
Okay, gentlemen, would you both like to take a stab at that? Tony, would you like to start?
I think you've hit on something that is going to be a problem. The identification of the situation in which it becomes appropriate to take means, even if you've discussed them with the person. I would assume that as a beginning kind of move, we are talking about something that has been discussed with the person and agreed upon. I would think that at least as a beginning situation, you would both have to agree that, if I reach the point where I'm no longer able to respond to you, if I reach the point where, for all practical purposes, you're taking care of, a person in a coma or something like that. I'm not sure how else you would do it as a beginning point, except something along those lines. I have no further input about that.
John?
I would think there'd be the possibility that that the person who is the sick patient might feel a rejection of that person, a rejection of the self, even though the reasons for feeling that it'd be a merciful thing for the self not to be continuing to live, but still the self could regard this as a rejection. And I don't know, I have no way of knowing just how to evaluate that. I was terribly impressed by the fact that the Supreme Court went out of its way to praise the parents of Nancy Cruzan, because it would be quite possible in this setup to have quite other motives, as we know, either because the person is a complete nuisance or you want some of the person's property. I mean, all sorts of other things.
You may know, or be interested to know if you don't, that the people who sponsored the Humane and Dignified Death Initiative specified that an individual who would be a subject for active euthanasia should have a couple of physicians, I believe it was 2 physicians, verify that the person is 6 months terminal. And whether that can medically be done, I think, is a question, but at least that gives some answer to, indirectly to, I think, your question in regard to at least somebody's ideas. Yes, sir.
Christian theologians have long emphasized life as God's great gift. And I wonder if in the context of euthanasia, the concept that death is God's great gift might be helpful to people considering it and their families.
Tony, you talked about innovation in morals. What about that, the innovation of death being a gift?
Well, the quotation from Governor Lamb that John was referring to that got misquoted in the New York Post, the original quotation from Governor Lamb was a line from Shakespeare, which is, "We owe God a death." I mean, that in some sense, with the gift of life comes a recognition that God will take back the gift. I think that you could begin with a theology of death by talking about the sense of life as God's grace. I mean, the sense of life as God's gift, and always, therefore, something that we hold in stewardship rather than we have for ourselves. I do think that it's worth emphasizing that it is that our control over our life is in God's hands, or in the hands of some higher power. One of the things that I worry about with regard to suicide is I really worry about a situation where you have somebody dying and you have the implicit message being sent by harried relatives, why don't you commit suicide? I mean, that strikes me as, you know, a kind of situation where you certainly don't want to end up forcing people to commit suicide. I mean, that's the last thing you want to happen. And so you need, I think, a very strong sense that life is always subject to, you know, some higher justification than just you feel like living.
Our speaker and our respondent, and we want to thank you for coming, and I hope that you can come back and bring a friend in 3 weeks. Dr. Dan Callahan will be here with us. Good evening.